Before introducing today's speaker, we would like to acknowledge an important milestone. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics. Since its founding, the center has played a central role in advancing healthcare ethics here at St. Vincent and across Providence's footprint, as well as contributing to the field nationally and internationally. This means that we and those who came before us and who have supported us share a deep commitment to providing patients, their loved ones, and those who care for them with thoughtful ethical analysis, guidance, and support in the midst of complex ethical medical decision-making. Crucially, the center's approach and method is not to train clinicians when to call ethics to make the hard decisions, but to learn how through ethics coaching, consultation, education, and vocational development. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Kevin Dirksen. Kevin serves as the director of at the Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics and holds the Andy and Bev Hansel Endowed Chair in Applied Healthcare Ethics. Under his leadership, the center has expanded its consultative and educational programs, as well as has launched the Fellowship in Clinical Ethics and Health Justice here at Providence. Kevin has published in national and international peer-reviewed publications such as the American Journal of Bioethics, the Journal of General Internal Medicine, the Journal of Pain and Symptom Management, and Ethics, Medicine, and Public Health. Kevin lectures widely from local invited presentations to representing the work of the center at national, regional, national, and international conferences. And it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Kevin Dirksen.
Well, sorry to get a late start here this morning, but glad we've got not only folks here in the room, but also joining us online now. So thanks to Tim, Stephanie, and the crew for helping get everyone loaded electronically, as it were. Great also to be introduced by Nick, who came up with this idea to do the Hansel lecture series back in 2020. And as I like to say, came up with an idea, did it once, and then handed it off to me for the next subsequent years. So if you like the talk, you can thank me. And if you didn't like it, you can blame Nick for getting this started 6 or 7 years ago. But before I get started today, I do have a somber word to pass along to those who are St. Vincent stalwarts. Yesterday, we lost Dr. Kurt Holzgang, a beloved faculty member, emeritus medical director of the ICU, and somebody who had literally co-founded the Ethics Center back in 2000. And so it wouldn't be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to thank Kurt, his family, and we feel him in his presence here in the room with us this morning. I'll share just a brief quote from a book that he published with a medical trainee who he worked with years ago in a memoir called Fortunate. If any of you would like a copy, just pop over to the Ethics Center across from the ED and we'll get you a copy. But on the closing pages of that book, Kurt shares a quote being from a Swiss ancestry that he really loved. And so from Andre Emile, a Swiss philosopher, life is short and we have little time to gladden the hearts of those who travel with us. Be swift to love, make haste to be kind. Thank you, Dr. Holzgang. So the title of my presentation today, Seeing a Future at Risk, Personhood, Moral Triage, and Lifeboat Ethics. This is a presentation that I see as building off of a talk that I gave yesterday with my colleagues in leadership for the North Division and South Division in ethics, Jennifer Dunatov and Mark Carr. And we essentially offered a presentation that tried to ground the realities that we're practicing in today as not just being challenging or not just being difficult, but actually being in times of of cruelty. And we thought that's an important framing because all of the associative ills that are experienced by our patients, by our communities, and by the healthcare workforce have to be realistic in the environments in which we're practicing. And so I'd like to build off of that that talk last year, and share with you a couple of highlights that I think I'd really encourage, not just a way of thinking about the environment we're in, but some practical strategies to consider deploying in your practice. But before I get too much farther, I'd like to share a quote from a book that was published just a few years ago, but has really helped me think about some of those associated phenomena that are impacting those of you who are practicing on the front lines of the healthcare workforce, from Larry Kent Graham's book on moral injury, Restoring Wounded Souls. Graham writes, "The fabric of the moral life is woven from the thread spun in our everyday interactions. We continually ask ourselves, what is the right thing to do in our unique circumstances? Every inner dialogue that we have with ourselves and every verbal and behavioral conversation we have with others is a social process infused with moral elements. We are moral beings through and through, and can never shut off the moral turbines that idle and roar inside and around us." And so, to remind of the times in which we practice those times of cruelty, I have to update my slides from last year. It's a different year than it was preceding the Hansel lecture last year. And here are a couple of things I'd like to ground us in. First, definitionally. And I've pulled some examples from the New York Times in terms of some editorials that I've written, both from more right-leaning and left-leaning sources, of some examples in the last several weeks. But it's important to know that a definition of cruelty, if it's important to take away this notion that these times aren't just hard or difficult, but they're actually cruel times, it's important to know that it need not be intentional to be cruel. It may also be the negligent infliction of suffering on those whose future is at risk. And we're going to talk about why that language is important as we continue on. So one of the pieces that was starting to develop last year, but we didn't quite know where would land yet with a myriad of court challenges, was the dissolution of USAID, the Agency for International Aid Development, replaced by a America First Global Health Strategy, which, per the Secretary of the Department of State website, identifies a positive and forward-looking vision for United States leadership in global health built around 3 pillars: a strategy prioritizing the interests of Americans and making Americans safer, stronger, and more prosperous. Maybe not curious for a domestic agenda, but globally an interesting framing, to be sure. So I'm going to share with you a clip from a documentary released by The New Yorker in the last few months, where Dr. Atul Gawande is trying to make sense of the impact associated with the dissolution of USAID, and helps ground us in an understanding of the applied cruelty that is happening because of actions here domestically.
After the foreign aid termination, visiting the clinic and the community would help me see what the actual impact has been.
We're going to have a walk through the hospital. Clinic 7 provides the highest level of care for all refugees. This is our triage area. So as you can see, it's usually quite chaotic. To run this whole operation, I only have 5 doctors.
5 doctors for 300,000 people, so 1 per 60,000.
We started to see the impacts of the funding cuts quite early when we had the first wave of people being let go of. there was a lot of incredulity. Like this can't be happening. This actually cannot be happening. It seemed unimaginable that the cuts would be as bad as they were and affect the sectors where life-saving activities were ongoing. Because malnutrition is such a huge problem in this population, there's a specific word for them, the stabilization center. This is baby York. This is a child who's been in and out of the hospital for the past 1 month, I would say.
She doesn't have as much wasting.
Yes, they are improving slowly.
Yeah. Children with acute malnutrition lose their ability to fend off disease.
This is Sunday, the baby is being treated for pneumonia.
These are vulnerable children who aren't getting enough protein and calories to survive. I would expect this would be the most fragile population who would be harmed by aid cuts.
I see the admissions are up. Yeah. The World Food Program cuts has started in February, so it's 2 months of lack of food. Now we're starting to see the surge. Yeah.
One of the cases I wanted to show you was actually of this baby. During Sunday, they
So as you can see, and estimates are still ranging, but the best that I've seen published is estimating 600,000 deaths associated directly from the termination of USAID globally, a number that is surely to rise as we estimate more of the impact and trend that longitudinally. But I think it's important for us to see directly because the cuts to international aid don't necessarily happen on our commute home, but they happen on shores in lands far away for us to see acutely what that cruelty can look like. Furthermore, we see now in the response to the Ebola outbreak in Africa, specifically in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that some of the aid cuts are also impacting our ability to respond to communicable disease threats, which, as we know from even a cursory examination of history, don't just impact those in a household, those in a neighborhood, or those in a local community, but can reach across borders in indiscriminate ways. And so a former director of an agency within the USAID is here in this recent Chicago Tribune op-ed is commenting upon how the initial decision to pause Ebola prevention funding was thought to be accidental, but later was never replaced. And so we're directly seeing in a real-time global communicable disease threat the impact of the inability to sustain that funding in ways that not only help make others safer, but also make Americans safer as well. And if you're not a fan of Chicago Tribune op-eds or New Yorker documentaries, we only need to look to the medical literature as well, and looking how the global distribution of research efforts, disease burden, and impact of U.S. public funding is all inextricably linked. And so we are literally preventing our ability to respond to health threats due to decisions that we're making domestically. And furthermore, the ways in which we're seeing discourse around vaccines impacting our ability, I need not tell that to those who are in the audience from an internal medicine residency program in our clinics. We're seeing a weaponization of the discourse of vaccines that are affecting the health of the most vulnerable here locally. And in my research for this presentation, that I was surprised to learn is how that discourse has exported internationally as well. And so measurably, we've seen not only in the United States, but we've seen across across international footprint, a decrease of populations who think that vaccines are safe over the interval from 2015 to 2024. And if you look at and try to figure out why is that the case, well, it happens to be because of American vaccine misrepresentation accounts are disproportionately impacting global misinformation networks. And so we see that in one separate longitudinal analysis, almost 300 million tweets on Twitter X found that only 800 super spreader accounts generate that 300 million and are demonstrably impacting the ways in which people, not only here in the United States, but across the globe, are looking at the science and looking at the safety of vaccines. And so we truly have a crisis of credibility around not just domestic vaccine misinformation, but across the globe as well. And so it's hard for me not to see how not only have we stopped sending aid, but we're also exporting disinformation in ways that are making folks sicker. And what about us here at home? So I talked about Ebola and the spreading infectious disease threat that we know back in the Ebola crisis of 2015 came to our shores in the United States, and only due to some very significant efforts was contained. That we are now in a much weaker position post-COVID to handle a public health emergency. And take that from Lawrence Gostin, who's a public health and epidemiological expert out of Georgetown. So when we look at both vaccines and we look at declining to contribute to aid in the same ways, these are manifest examples of how cruelty is emanating from the policy decisions we make, which may seem difficult for us to impact and appreciate, but are nonetheless real and nonetheless are the conditions in which we're practicing today. So, somber note to be sure, but times of cruelty indeed continue. When I presented on this with my colleagues last year, it wasn't a blip, but arguably accelerating in some respects, almost like a wildfire. So I would close out this initial discussion by saying the normalization of cruelty does not make it any less cruel. And so I want to do a little bit of heavy lifting from a case perspective and even, bear with me, a little bit of philosophy to help us think about how we can understand what we're seeing and maybe try to make inroads into preventing further inroads on our watch. So I'll close out the same way I have closed out before, which is a call from Dr. Berwick. When the fabric of communities upon which health depends is torn, healers are called to mend it. The moral law within, not just within ourselves, but within the healing ethos of the professions insists so. And so while the poet Ada Limon writes, people have done this before, but not us, that is a call for us to take up this challenge like those who have come before us. So why are we here? Why are we looking at these times of cruelty? Why are we seeing the linkage between the moral life and how those turbines idle and roar inside of us? Because we need to figure out how to respond accordingly. Every day we wake up, every patient we see, every interaction is one where we can choose, we have choice about how we can prioritize the good. And so whereas last year I shared maybe if we could compound some moral medicine, some pieces that I thought were pretty helpful, I'm going to be a lot more straightforward and instead not provide how we should be thinking about the ways in which we can move forward, but what can we actually do? And you'll let me know in the Q&A if this lands or not. So the plan. From here on out, we're going to talk about 5 pieces. Actually, 4. We're already done with the first part. We're going to talk about how acting ethically takes intention and vision. We're going to talk about how we need to keep it simple and treating persons like persons. We are going to address how the work of ethics is also the work of some triage at times, choosing what it is that we can care about. And then finally, this notion of lifeboat ethics, which I'm interested in discussing in the Q&A, how you approach that in your practice. So one question might be, well, why this title of Seeing a Future at Risk? Where did this come from? Why is that relevant to you? Well, as Nick said, we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Center for Healthcare Ethics, and we find ourselves over at our little ethics house across from the ED between consults, which have been a kind of fast and furious couple of days, few weeks, few months, reflecting on foundational contributions and cornerstone contributors, looking at what are some of those pieces of enduring wisdom, moral medicine maybe, that we can kind of hold on to and continue to have that inspire us in our teaching. And so while I currently serve as the Hansel Endowed Chair, Nick, that was a role was in prior to becoming our system ethicist. The very first, before so named, was Father John Toohey, served as the Endowed Chair. And I want to share a little bit from John, which I couldn't do last year, about how we need to think about this concept of
prophets. They keep that idea, that image we is really about standing up for principles, then you really got to be that strong Superman kind of person. But if prophetic leadership is about noticing someone's future at risk and being committed to securing that future and using principles and core values as tools to achieve that, then the prophet isn't just for the big moments, but also for the more intimate moments. I was in Medford last Thursday, and they were talking about a last-minute Christmas tree drive that they did to get Christmas trees and presents for some of the poor in Medford. You know, and they were saying, "Oh, this is a real nice thing for us to be doing." It's more than nice. It's prophetic. It's seeing a future at risk and doing something to secure it. Prophets aren't just about the big things. We are prophetic in the intimate moments as well.
So, seeing a future at risk and doing something to secure it, not just in the big moments about vaccine disinformation or about global aid cuts, but about the small moments too, the ones that constitute the moral lives in which we are given. So sometimes something more is required than merely allowing this information to pass us by, to allow these moral encounters to pass us by. And I want to start with a case in order for us to see what this might look like in practice. So I want to share with you a case of a 51-year-old woman who was status post tracheostomy, who's not on a ventilator, but who is tube feeding dependent and lives at an intermediate care facility. The patient is chronically on medications to prevent seizure-like activity and occasionally is hospitalized for infections of the urinary tract or other sources, as well as admissions for breakthrough seizures. Per the ED provider who's admitting her, she has a history of brainstem stroke in 2023 causing locked-in syndrome. She has no ability to communicate. Continuing with the HPI, patient is transferred here after she was started on ertapenem, a broad-spectrum antibiotic, with improvement in her pressor, blood pressure medication, which we use in the ICU to treat life-threatening hypotension. Started on ertapenem with improvement in pressor need, but urology was consulted and determined she wasn't a surgical candidate for removal of her likely infected bladder stones in the setting of her acute infection. The patient's husband and daughter elected for comfort care only. However, the sister, who lives in Florida, is allegedly the DPOA and stated she is to be full code with full cares and hopes for recovery. She asked for the patient to transfer for a second opinion for urology here. So when I think about a case, I think about these three questions that were shared to me by my mentor in clinical ethics, Dr. Robert Potter. And he says one way to start is by asking, what's going on here? What should we care about? And what's the fitting response? And so I hope that maybe we could talk very briefly about that second question of what it is that we should care about, which is an important moment of moral triage in a situation to be able to ask what it is that we need to direct our attention to. So I want to pause for a moment and gain some feedback from the audience. As this case comes to me, came to our ethics team, I'm interested in what you see as something that we should be caring about here. What is the focus? What is the what should the ethicist's attention be on in a case like this? And I'll go ahead and repeat instead of running the mic. So maybe just shout out, what do you think within this case study is most important? Am I going to have to do that I'll wait you out thing? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the question being, is the sister actually the durable power of attorney for healthcare? Or in Oregon, we would typically refer to that as the person appointed in an advance directive, the healthcare representative. Is the daughter, is the sister the legal decision maker or not? And then pairing with that, a pretty sick patient, right? This is a patient who is on broad spectrum antibiotics, even though less pressor need, still on pressors. Urology can't remove the infected bladder stones. She's too acute. So how do we put these pieces together? Yeah. How about some head nods? Is that the ethics issue? Do you see other ethics issues that we should focus on? Yeah. Yeah, so it's a great question. So do we have an idea of what the patient said that she would want, right? So very quickly, and I don't have to say this as an ethicist, I think many of us could say this from our clinical practice as well. We get kind of downstream pretty quickly on the question of, well, who's the surrogate decision maker? What's the surrogate saying? What should we do? But maybe going upstream a little bit, what would the patient herself want, or what had she said? And potentially, we're at a place with this patient's brainstem strokes that maybe that episode happened and she wasn't then able to make decisions after that about her care. We don't quite know if and when capacity, how that hit in her not acute disease course, right? But the sort of brainstem strokes that occurred in 2023. But it's an important question to always ask, but what about the patient, right? Thank you. Yeah. Maybe a little louder so I can hear. Yeah. Yeah, so what was relayed to me, and again, you're talking to non-clinically trained, non-doc, non-nurse, non-nothing ethics guy up here, is that she was too acute. So in the ICU, on broad spectrum antibiotics, on pressors, it's likely something that we could consider once her kind of acute infection has resolved. Likely if she has these infected bladder stones, we're not going to have source control. We'll need to get at those at some point. But it's not a matter of categorically not a surgical candidate, but not a surgical candidate now. Gosh, I hope I didn't butcher that clinical description. Any other thoughts about what we should focus on here? These are all pieces. I affirm entirely that these are pieces that we should be attentive to. Yeah, so again, I don't know where on the stream metaphor we would situate that, downstream, upstream, with the surrogate's preferences, what did the patient want? But at some point we should be asking, what does good medicine look like for somebody in this clinical condition? Maybe generally from a chronic perspective, but also acutely now. And so we have to index our discussions to the clinical reality and maybe what's on the table, what's medically recommended. Last one. Yeah. Yeah, so this is really important to focus on because there's a way of approaching what might be seen as somewhat of a surrogate decision maker conflict here, right? And we kind of come at it with our textbooks and our algorithms and formulas, and we're like, Who is the surrogate decision maker? Does this person have authority? Do we then just merely turn to that person and ignore the noise and all the other perspectives on the matter? And we actually, in this case, engaged a little bit on that question and trying to clarify what was the kind of purported documentary evidence establishing or not establishing the sister's ability to make decisions. How does that situate within a surrogate hierarchy system? If there was no such documentary preference, who do we turn to per relevant state law, per hospital policies on a default list of surrogate decision makers? But in this case, which was interesting and a little bit of a sequitur from this presentation, is the kind of relational dynamics that can exist within a family unit. And so the team took great pains to try to remind, after doing some of that background sleuthing, that the sister was not appointed in any role, but it would default to the patient's her partner, her husband. But every time we tried to do that, he would also then bring the sister in, bring his family unit in. And so we, from a more relational autonomy perspective, needed to pull folks into the mix. So sometimes we can't as easily tease those dynamics out and have to figure out how best are we going to live with maybe a primary voice, but in relationship with others. So thanks for bringing that up. So what I would also say about what we need to focus on is this one piece on the underlying clinical neurological status that this patient comes in with. And I quickly, in my review of the chart, and again, not a clinical guy, not trained in neurology, but a notion of some discrepancies in the chart around her baseline neurological state. And so in the case summary, I put, there was quotes for locked-in syndrome from the admitting ED provider. I'm like, okay, well, we don't always put diagnoses in quotes. What's that all about? Is that effectively locked in or what have you? And so I asked the question in the consult, is this patient in the locked-in syndrome or is this chart lore? Because if we look at the other clinical diagnoses on the differential diagnosis, a diagnosis of locked-in syndrome is a distinction with a difference, given that in the locked-in syndrome, there is not just an ability to sort of tap into what had the patient wanted historically, but could tell us now what her preferences are. And so surrogate decision-making 101 is, medical decision-making 101 is we don't turn to a surrogate if we have the patient themselves we can speak to. And so again, a little bit of a deeper dive and an artistic representation of the diving bell and the butterfly, a text and a movie on Jean-Dominique Barbie, who was a French journalist who I think in a motorcycle accident ended up suffering a traumatic incident that resulted in being in the locked-in syndrome. And unlike the vegetative state, which is sometimes described as PVS or the unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, where a patient retains wake and sleep cycles, but there is no evidence of awareness of self or the environment, not conscious per se. In the locked-in syndrome, consciousness is retained. There is an awareness of self and the environment, albeit with the difficulty in communicating preferences. So ethically speaking, that's a big deal. That is a future at risk, a future that's not as simple as, does the sister get to make the decisions? What is the husband's sort of claim around comfort care or not comfort care? What the patient may have said historically, what good medicine looks like, but what is this patient inside thinking, experiencing, feeling about the health state that she is in? And so, again, like many things, there's not a clear answer or solving this, similar to the question about why was she not a surgical candidate for the removal of the infected bladder stones. It was very difficult to confirm the diagnosis while she was sort of this acute, but that putting it on the radar to get a more substantive neurological workup and seeing if there's a reliable way we can communicate with the patient herself, sometimes through communication assist devices, blinking, or even some really crazy neurological imaging, can we communicate with patients whose consciousness is retained, but has barriers in communicating that. So I would call this as a question of asking, seeing a future at risk and trying to do something to secure it. Also, I was heartened to see, and just at an international clinical ethics conference last week in, of all places, Cleveland, Ohio, chatting with some scholars from this program, learned about how we are engaging with bioethics programming across the globe. And so in this write-up from America Magazine, Bioethics Under Bombs, a global health partnership in Ukraine, tells the story of a bioethics program who got a letter from another bioethics program, another director, and said, hey, we need help. We need support, resources. Can we build a partnership? That was before the invasion of Ukraine. That was before the COVID-19 pandemic, but persisted despite these setbacks due to some grant funding, some commitments, et cetera. I would call this a very tangible representation of doing something about seeing a future at risk, maybe less so initially, but especially as the war in Ukraine and the conflict raged on, how a bioethics program, again, within my kind of family of what we do day to day, showed up for folks across the globe in a significant way. So I said we're going to do a little bit of philosophy, and we got just a handful of minutes here until Q&A. So we'll kind of breeze through this, but when you have an ethicist who's not clinically trained come do grand rounds, you get what you get. But I want to share a little bit with you on some of the unresolved philosophical problems that can lead us to how it is that we can think about the ways that we essentially don't treat people as persons, but we treat persons as something less than. That is a social problem. That is a philosophical problem. It's arguably even a medical problem as well. And so some of you may have seen over the last few days, recency bias alert trending on social media. African-American man decided to put on a MAGA hat and go walk around and see what he experienced, and then ends up detailing how both from right of the political spectrum and left of the political spectrum, perhaps obviously, there was some pushback that in a sense, and I was really caught by this quote of how fast both sides, stopped seeing a person the second they saw a symbol. I don't think that's a left thing or a right thing. I think that's an us thing. And so how can there be some symbols that we imbue with meaning beyond the personal, beyond the identity? Not to say that we don't have strong feelings about such symbols, but how we relate to the individuals for whom may claim those symbols. And so this got me going down on a rabbit hole in preparation from this talk and thinking about the various philosophical problems that we see around how we can treat human beings as something less than. Probably we're all students of history enough to know that propaganda is a real thing, that the depiction of someone as an other can be an intentional weaponization of discourse, of imagery for a political purpose. And here I depersonalized it, but have a slide about how abstinence is more powerful than penicillin, with the shadow of VD or a sexually transmitted disease looming over that. A marketing campaign, a public health campaign rather, out of Germany in the 1940s. But we also see that there are ways in which persons can depersonalize the self. And so that was illustrated in part in a 1959 Scientific American write-up of Joey the Mechanical Boy, when Bettelheim essentially presented a case study of a boy who saw himself as a machine and was able to depersonalize the self. Or we can talk about D.W. Winnicott's 1971 theory on transitional objects. Think of the child with the blanket or the child with the lovey, endowing an object with almost a person-like sort of substance, and how that can, effectively serves as a transition for an individual identifying something other than themselves that has meaning as a way to then be able to connect with parents, to be able to connect with siblings, to be able to connect with the outside environment. Or we can even go way back to 1900. Henri Bergson presented a essay on laughter, an essay on the meaning of the comic, and distinguished between two main forms of essentially artistic representation at the time, the dramatic and the comic, and how comedy serves as a way of depersonalizing, of introducing laughter when you turn an object of derision into a joke. And so I share this because there are a myriad set of ways in which we can see how objects become subjects, subjects can become objects, and it's not just it's not just something that bad guys or despotic regimes do with propaganda, but it is something that we all can fall prey to not treat another as a person, or in religious imagery, a beloved by God, etc. And so on the flip side, I introduced these two images. On the right is perhaps the first artistic representation of artificial intelligence in Der Golem by a sort of Jewish mystical source. Or on the left, the employee of the month, which is not you or me or somebody who we're trying to battle with for a promotion, but the Roomba in the laundry cabinet. And so I'll just share this quote from Pope Leo, who in his encyclical Magnificat Humanatis writes about artificial intelligence in this way. So-called AIs do not undergo experiences, do not possess a body, do not feel joy or pain, do not mature through relationships, and do not know from within what love, work, friendship, or responsibility mean. Nor do they have a moral conscience, since they do not judge good and evil, grasp the ultimate meaning of situations, or bear responsibility for consequences. And so that's the sort of, in the reverse, the challenge for the human condition. Do we take up those things, or are we abdicating our humanity in the face of artificial intelligence? And so I'll share this quote from one of my mentors in the field, Paul Scotsman, who shares, "We should always choose behaviors that best serve the promotion of the human person in all one's dimensions and in all one's relationships." So I would say a challenge to you all is to simply treat people like persons. It's easier said than done, but it's a social problem, a philosophical problem. Patients are not diagnoses. It's so surprising to go on rounds occasionally and still hear some language like, I have the 62-year-old alcoholic who, whoa, you have a human being who has a disease, right? And sometimes we can slip in ways that objectify the subject. We can turn to sources like Paul Ramsey's Patient as Person, which he contrasted against a sense of useful pre-cadavers, something we all would push back on, right? But can be jarring how sometimes language can portend otherwise, like Samuel Shem did in his 1978 satirical novel, The House of God, and introduced for us the notion more broadly of the Gomer, the get out of my emergency room patient. Would say also we see that incarceration or legal status should not dictate care or obviate sort of our core ethical duties. In many professions, still having that fiduciary duty to act in the patient's best interest. So we need to hold out and hold to our values in settings where a patient's legal status might be asking of us to do something different than we would for any other patient. And then also I would say that AI aspect is for us to thoughtfully reflect on how should we interact with AI? How should it be regulated? Who are we becoming as AI technologies become more prevalent? What's its environmental impact? All of these are considerations that we should be mindful of as healers. And so we're going to tie up the 5-point plan here with these last two together, that moral triage and lifeboat ethics. And what I will just introduce here is this notion of, and those of you who hang around me enough have heard this before, is we often can't be everybody's everything. But there's a difference between being that and nobody's nothing as well. How can we be somebody's something? How can we be our patient's healer? How can we be our community's scientific trained dialogue partners when these issues come up on social media, when they come up in family discussions, et cetera. And one of our ethicists, Sarah Combs, introduced me to this quote by Rabbi Tarfon that I hold to a lot, is while we are not obligated to complete the work, neither are you free to abandon it either. So this moral triage, what should we care about, is something that I would suggest is of critical importance. That's not to say that we don't need to care about those other issues in the ethics consult we talked about. All of those are important, but also where someone's future is at risk is an opportunity for us to do something about it, in the language of Nick and my predecessor, Father Toohey. So I think I'll go ahead and draw it to a close here and just offer this lifeboat ethics imagery was, I think, best encapsulated by some seminal material in the Ethics Center's tradition, which is both an image of the game of Twister and a quote or a paraphrase of a quote by Brother David Steindl-Rast, a Catholic Christian mystic of sorts. And he offered that ethics is how we behave when we decide we belong together. And that was an image that Father Toohey, Nick and my predecessor, liked to use to say, in a game of Twister, game doesn't work if we just show up and start sideswiping people or sit right in the middle of the board. But you all kind of have to agree we're going to play this silly game together. We're going to move our arms and limbs around. And similar, what I think about in an ethics consult, and I would imagine you all do as well in some of your work, is how can we create containers of belonging so that even in the most difficult of circumstances, an end-of-life debate among surrogate decision makers, like in a version of what I presented in the case, how can we focus on the patient? How can we focus on shared goals? How can we live together, work together, belong together, and maybe do that ethically? So I'm interested in the Q&A if you have strategies there, because I'd love to steal those for ethics consults. I'm sure others would be interested, and hopeful we can engage the audience in some Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. What are your questions?
I know we have a couple questions online, but we usually like to start with folks in the room. Any burning questions from those in the audience? I'm happy to run a mic to you.
Well, if I may get us started, you began the presentation with recalling and expanding on this notion of the cruelty of our times. And I'm wondering, an element that I think you brushed on here and there, but I'm wondering if you could give some more focused commentary on the relationship between hope and despair in this ethic that you're proposing.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think that what I'm trying to offer is essentially an antidote to having to fix it all, right? So I see on either end sort of something we should avoid. On the one hand, feeling so responsible and feeling so like this is something that we should somehow find a way to prevent the closure or the reopening of USAID, or to single-handedly go on and combat vaccine disinformation. But on the other end, to ignore it as well and to not recognize. And again, I try to use in the last couple of years here this really stark language of cruel times, and to just merely put our heads in the sand and not see it for what it is. People are being harmed. People are being left behind. People are not being having their futures at risk attended to. And so what can we do? We're not obligated to finish the work, but we're not obligated to not engage in it either. That Rabbi Tarfon paraphrase. Or what can we do? I mean, I think that's the hopeful bit. One of the case studies that I was hoping to share with you was, if any of you are NPR listeners this morning on the BBC NewsHour, talking about 50 years ago. One of the initial catalyzing events that resulted in the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa was a elected president of a high school who said, "I would like to protest the use of Afrikaans as the language in school." And so what did she do? She started a protest, and that protest became essentially the tinderbox for resistance against the apartheid regime. One high school girl who was elected president of her student body said, "We're going to protest one small bit of the apartheid regime." And so, again, I think that that can be an example of how in other presentations, I've talked about viral justice. I've talked about how these little acts can seed our moral communities in ways that maybe are combating some of those cruel aspects that we see today. And so I would say that's the hope. The hope is that we can take tangible steps to be able to interact toward the health of our communities.
Thank you, Kevin. We do have one question from the chat from Sarah, who asks, as clinicians, how can we hold the space in the everyday? What are some shortcuts to bring us back to steer away from the cruelty around us when we hear the stigmatizing language and harmful choices?
Kevin, as you go to answer that, I'll share. Someone messaged me separately who's a nurse here at Providence St. Vincent, said that you had asked for things that people do. And I think this sort of feeds into your
Yeah,
answer.
that's what I was going to do, flip the
to
question
Sarah's
back.
question, yeah. She wrote that she chooses to celebrate patients' birthdays and be aware of them more than she feels like time allows, even if it keeps her a little bit over, because it connects her to the fact that the patient once had their first birthday and that their parents, that someone gave birth to them. And it sort of like grounds her in remembering that patients are people too, and not just people in gowns in front of us.
I'm going to take a page out of Father Tui's book there from that short video clip I shared and say the example that he was referring to of hearing about a last-minute Christmas tree and present drive in Medford, probably now 2 decades ago. I don't know. It's not a nice thing to do. That was acting, seeing a future at risk and doing something about it. I would say celebrating birthdays for patients could be in that vein. I don't want to speak in too much hyperbole, but as a outside observer to the practice of medicine, there are dehumanizing elements even in the care we provide every day to patients, where we essentially take a human person with a biographical history, with complex needs, emotions, lovers, children, dependents, all of these things, and we turn them into a problem list. We turn them into, an object of medical gaze in order to do the work that we do and save lives and take care of people and reduce comorbidities and provide, the important care we provide. But how do we build them back up again? How do we essentially be forces for repersonalization or building that person up? And I think celebrating birthdays could be one of them. And so I think that those little aspects are ones that we need to really give a lot of thought to in the care we provide.
I just add.
Yeah.
One other, when I first started in the work of clinical ethics, one of the things I challenged myself to do was to change the language with which I charted. And I think it kind of comes to, the example of the referring to the patient as the alcoholic. It's how do we contextualize that description without reducing the person to the diagnosis. So that can itself be the way we chart, the way we document our care can be a way we do that. One of the first challenges I had was to think of another way of saying the non-compliant patient. So just challenge yourself to think about a way to describe that behavior pattern without any connotation of judgment. That itself is a heavy lift.
And happy to engage others in Q&A afterward. And as I said last year, the slides are available by PDF, so go ahead and email us and we can get those sent out. But thank you for your time.